Well, over the past couple of years, I have been on what you might call a learning journey. I've always been kind of a hoarder of information. I just love to store it and keep it up. But something switched with me a couple of years ago where I just became really hungry to take some of that information and make it my own, put it into my heart, learn more, gain new skills, regain old skills. I tried to pick up learning biblical Hebrew back from my seminary days again a couple years ago. And then I found a book on a critical moment in Christian history, a textbook, a thick book that I just dove into. And this was about a year ago. And I'm proud to say that I'm about 10% the way through that book as we speak. But along the way, I realized something. Wanting to learn doesn't make me a good learner. I'm a slow reader. My 8-year-old can already pass me with laps in reading. And every time I read to her, she's always pointing out the words that I missed or the words that I got wrong. So I decided to go back to the basics and pick up a couple of books on how to learn, how to even just read better. But here's what I'm learning about learning. My biggest problem may not actually be speed, although, that's an area I can grow in, but it may be attention. For those of you who have been reading for a long time, or for those of you kids who are just starting to learn how to read today, maybe this is something that you've experienced, but sometimes I work through a page, and I work through a page, and I work through a page, and I found that I've read a page 3 times without even actually reading the page. It turns out that scrolling, video on demand, attention milking media, and instant gratification in this wireless world that we live in, well, it's actually changing the way that our brains are wired. Hours and hours of doing this have essentially hijacked my ability to process. My brain has literally been changed, not because of an environment that I chose, but because of an environment that I accepted. Well, that's not only true of attention, is it? It happens in the way that we speak before we think. It happens in the way that we defend ourselves before we listen. The way that anger becomes normal in our lives, or when comparison becomes automatic, or when fear teaches us what we should expect from different people. Over time, brokenness doesn't just happen to us, it gets practiced by us, and then it gets into us. And by the time we finally notice, well, it can feel too late. But what if discovering the problem this far down the road doesn't mean that we have to surrender? We're now in our 4th week of our series called Summer Reading, and this has given us an opportunity to step back and to look at God's big, grand story throughout Scripture. The first couple of weeks, we looked at God's creation, how it's beautiful, how it's good, and invites us to experience meaning. Last week, we started the journey looking at the twisted side of the fall, and we saw how sin entered the world through the story of Adam and Eve. And today we're going to continue to lean into that, the fall. Genesis shows us that sin is not just a little mistake. It breaks what is good and it twists us. Sin is paradise broken. But because we are created to bring order, to make, to multiply, to spread out, and to repair things, it's easy for us to think, even maybe just intuitively believe, that the fall is something that we can fix, at least in our own worlds. And in a limited way, well, that's not entirely wrong. But when we try to fix brokenness beyond our limits, hope turns into exhaustion. First, we try to manage things, and then we try to hide things. Eventually, we hide things from ourselves. We tell ourselves that our marriage is fine because, well, we had just one good week. The anger is just stress. The anxiety is just responsibility. The habit is under control because nobody knows. The room is clean because everything got shoved under the bed. We can spend years calling something handled when it's really just hidden. But what if there was a space where everything didn't have to be fixed? At least not yet. Where pretending could lose its power. And what if that opened up a door for us not only to live honestly, but for us also to be changed? Well, if that's true, then it's worth exploring this question together today. How do we keep going when the brokenness feels bigger than we thought? Bigger than we thought. Well, we aren't the first ones to wrestle with this question. It turns out that the first readers of Genesis not only were invited to remember about sin's entry into the world, but also how it got out of control. Well, in one of the strangest moments in the entire book. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the earth. Man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was evil continually. Now that is a statement. How did we get here? And what does that mean? Well, if you're reading along with me in Genesis chapter 6 in your Bibles, you may have noticed that I jumped over a part. We're gonna come back to that. That's important to this story. That's the strange part. But really, right now, we need to rewind even back further because this may have started at the garden, but it didn't just happen when Adam and Eve left the garden. If you've been following along in our summer reading program, you notice that there's a lot that comes after Adam and Eve before we get to this point. And it's actually the first time for me and my family that we have transitioned from a children's Bible to a full translation. So they weren't familiar with the story of Cain and Abel. And man, you can imagine the questions that come up and the conversation that came up. And they were both insistent that the two siblings that I was reading to were both insistent that the other one was way more like Cain than they were. Which I thought, well, that's ironic. But in this moment, in the middle of this scene, when we go back to Adam and Eve's children, Cain and Abel, we get God's sense of his jealousy. And this is what God says back in Genesis chapter 4. And before he ever commits this tragic act against God sends this warning before Cain ever commits the tragic act of murder against Abel. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." This is the first time that Genesis uses the word sin, first time that it appears in the Bible. And it's not in some faraway place like we might imagine it. It's not in a nation, it's not in a war, it's at the door of family. The fall begins in the garden, but Genesis immediately shows us how it spreads to the home. It keeps going, it doesn't stop. Have you ever seen those Progressive car insurance commercials? Or the ones where some adult comes to the tragic realization that they are becoming just like their parents. Well, it turns out it's quite a thing, and they've been carrying it for a while. A fictional psychologist by the name of Dr. Rick comes alongside these poor souls, trying to offer advice. You don't need to comment on how quickly or slowly a building is going up every time you pass a construction site. Sometimes you don't need to be helpful on someone else's property. You really shouldn't call expiration dates baloney just because there's pickle relish from Y2K that still tastes just fine. There's no reason you should be wearing a cell phone on the outside of your belt. That's what pockets are for. The commercials always end with we can't save you from becoming your parents, but we can save you on car insurance. We all know that we pick up from our families more than we were meant to. Tone, expressions, quirks, reflexes. But Genesis is pressing deeper than that. It shows up between brothers. It shows up in comparison. It shows up when one person feels overlooked and another person feels favored. It shows up in anger that we don't know what to do with. It shows up in jealousy that we don't want to name. It shows up in sadness that turns into resentment. And this is one of the first hard truths that the book of Genesis teaches us about sin. Sin travels. Sin travels. Not mechanically, not as though Cain had no responsibility, but what is broken could not stay in the garden. It was carried outside. But did you notice this fascinating expression that we also just read in Genesis chapter 4? Not only does sin travel, sin crouches. Sin crouches. What an image. This whole scene between Cain and Abel is set up with great tension. Abel comes and he offers this sacrifice, the best fats of the firstborn of his flock. And then Cain comes and he also offers a sacrifice from his harvest, but the way that it's compared and contrasted, you get the sense that Cain is really just discharging a duty, where Abel was bringing his very best to God. And when Cain learns that God is pleased with Abel's sacrifice and not so pleased with him, it leaves Cain feeling despondent. And God's reaction is that we just read. We'll show it up here again. It's really important here. Some translations say that if Cain does what is good, he'll be accepted. That word, though, literally means lifted up. And chances are, maybe a better way of reading that with this translation here is, why is your face downcast? If you do well, will not your countenance, your spirits be lifted up? That word well is the same root word that we talked about a couple of words ago. That's the root word for good. In the Hebrew, it's tov. And it doesn't just mean like a check off the box kind of thing. It means flourishing. It means wholeness. It's the opposite of half-hearted. It's the opposite of checking off the box. When you give your whole self, when you present your whole self to me, God is saying, then will you not be filled with joy? Your countenance will be lifted up. You will experience joy too. And that is so important. God's simple point is when you give your very best to God, you will be filled with joy. But when you hold back, something else takes its place. Disorder, damage, sin. Here, sin is not just presented as a decision, a habit, or an inheritance. It's a force. It's a power that can that can take over when we create space for it. When Cain did not give his best, sin came looking for the rest. Sin travels, it crouches, and as we move back into Genesis 6, it infects. It infects. If only Cain's failure had stayed with Cain. The Genesis tells us a different story. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continuously. This is important because it tells us where the real home of sin is at. It's in the heart. And the truth is, most of us don't see it, especially when there are so many things that are right and good in the world. Families that love well, neighbors that serve one another, communities where people sacrifice and they create beautiful things, laws that restrain evil, institutions that protect the vulnerable, teachers, doctors, first responders, ordinary people doing good every day. Genesis is not asking us to deny those things, but Genesis is asking us to notice that even when things look ordered on the surface, sin can still be doing a work underneath all of that. All of it. Because by Genesis 6, sin is not just crouching. It's not just crouching at the door. It's made its way into the imagination. It's made its way into the thoughts. It's made its way into the intentions of the heart. And when God has hold of the outside only, he doesn't really have hold of much. That's what makes this really haunting, actually. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continuously. Genesis is not describing bad behavior. It's describing a bent center. The place from which we plan, the place from which we desire, the place from which we hope, the place from which we imagine and choose has been pulled away from good. And that matters because we're often tempted to believe that if we just create the right structures, if we just put the right systems in place, if we just have the right accountability, if we just have the right habits, if we just do these things, then we can keep the damage contained. A couple years ago, I was invited to a free breakfast where they were hosting a presidential candidate during the most recent election. And I'm going to be honest with you, I usually do not go to those things. There are two things that I really love, though: free and breakfast. So I went, and they did their thing, and they opened things up for Q&A. It was a free breakfast for pastors in New Hampshire and the presidential candidate. And when they opened things up for Q&A, I was just kind of like surprised because all the questions were like softballs. I'm like, what's going on? Like, are we not going to like challenge? Who's going to stir things up? And against my better intentions, I spoke up and I said, and I just wanted to ask a difficult question because especially there's so many heavy questions and difficult. It's such a difficult time when we talk about faith and government and how those two things play together and how it has an impact on people and their fears who aren't people of faith, or maybe people of different faith, when people who are open and professing about their faith take on office, because often, legitimate or not, people are afraid that candidates will enforce their beliefs onto population. Now, I know that's a complicated conversation, and my intention is not to get into it here, but that's the question I wanted to bring. How are you going to speak to and reach the other side? That was the question I asked. And it became pretty clear that the question I asked wasn't exactly the question that they were answering. And he came up afterwards. We had a one-on-one a little bit and talked about it, just to get a little bit of clarity. He knew that the answer wasn't exactly right, but he did say something that was interesting, something that was thought-provoking. In his desire to see unity, he referred back to the Constitution, which is fitting as we celebrated our 250th yesterday, unity in the Constitution. And I think that there was something to what he was saying, something important. 250 years ago, there were no democratic republics. There were none. 250 years ago in 2 days, I guess I should say. But that didn't exist. And now here, that's common as much as the world struggles today. And that's amazing. We can thank God for ordered liberty. We can thank God for documents and laws and shared commitments that help restrain chaos and help us protect life. Genesis also is pressing deeper than that. A law can restrain the hand, but it cannot make the heart whole. A document can organize a society, but it cannot untwist the imagination. A system can punish violence, but it cannot remove the anger, fear, and pride that give violence its home. That's why sin is so discouraging. It not only travels through the families, it not only crouches at the door, it infects the center, it bends the heart until we can start calling evil good, until we can justify what we once would have grieved and been sad about, until brokenness feels normal because everyone around us has learned to live with it too. And now we're ready to come back to that strange moment in Genesis chapter 6, those first few verses, because it turns out that this is not just a human thing. There's something bigger and stranger going on. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now, this is one of the most debated passages in Genesis. Who are the Nephilim? Who are the sons of God? The sons of God, some say, were ancient rulers, powerful people taking whatever they wanted to. Some say that the sons of God in this passage were the combination of the descendants of Seth and the descendants of Cain. Seth was Adam and Eve's third child. But in recent years, one ancient view has gotten more traction. More scholars are saying now that the best reading of sons of God are spiritual beings in rebellion against God. Spiritual beings, not humans. And if that sounds strange, well, it is strange. It's weird. What do you do with that? But it may not be as strange to the story that Genesis is trying to tell here, because from the beginning, God shows himself as a God bringing order out of darkness and out of chaos. The very first few verses of the Bible, he's hovering over the void and the chaos, and that's probably not just there by accident. It's an invitation to look at God bringing order through creation to disorder that was already there, present before he started to create the world. That's all a little bit strange, but that might be a hint to a previous spiritual rebellion that occurred even before God started to create humanity and the world, and a conflict, a spiritual conflict that the world was born into. The garden, it was a place of ordered blessing where humanity was protected, commissioned, and called to expand God's good order into the world. But Adam and Eve, they were sent out of the garden. And Genesis tells us that Cain went further east of the garden still. And outside of Eden, the world becomes a place where sin crouches, where desires bend, and where powers beyond human understanding press in. The protection isn't the same all of a sudden. The stakes have been raised because human beings aren't the only actors anymore. So whatever happened in Genesis 6, the point is not merely that people made bad choices. The point is that disorder has become cosmic. Boundaries are breaking. Desire is taking. Power is corrupting. Even though the mighty men, that's another strange thing. The men of renown, whether they're heroes or not, this probably is pointing to a time of great war and violence and disorder. That's why Genesis 6 feels so heavy. Sin is not only personal, sin is not only generational, the sin is not only cultural, it's reinforced by powers that we barely understand. Jesus and the apostles, they knew this, and they understood it clearly. They didn't look at the world and see only bad habits and broken systems. They saw spiritual forces that were resisting the good order of God. So here's where Genesis has brought us. Sin does not stay at the door. It moves through the family, into the heart, across the world, and it's reinforced by powers that we barely understand. In a word, if I'm just trying to make this as simple as I can, sin is big. Sin is big. Bigger than we can comprehend. It is damage unhinged. Even when it seems controlled, it is wreaking havoc behind the scenes. And friends, it occupies spaces that our joy was meant to fill. There is not a lot of hope there. This is before the light of Jesus. This is before the forgiveness that comes through his cross. This is before the hope of his resurrection. The temptation for many of us reading these verses is to fast forward and get to the good part. And you know, that inclination isn't entirely wrong. Like, we should be people who live in light of the end of the story. At the same time, if we don't step into the same shoes that the first readers of Genesis were in, as uncomfortable as those shoes might be, we might be missing a point. We might be missing something that God is trying to teach us in this tense moment. Something that the story has to offer us. And I think that what the story has to offer us is simply this: the truth of sin. Or maybe I can spin it another way: the weight of sin. I was talking with one of our parents a couple of weeks ago, and they were just discouraged, as parents can be. Not just discouraged because of the difficulties of raising kids that are natural, discouraged because of their own unfaithfulness in parenting, their reactions that were overly harsh, their patience that had become too thin, words that came out that could not be taken back. And I know something about that too. As I've been praying more aggressively, as many of you know, as I've shared, more aggressively that God would meet me in some of my shortcomings, I've been praying that God would not just meet me in those shortcomings, but he would teach me in those shortcomings too. It's kind of been a key word for me, that teach. After all, doesn't the word disciple mean to be a learner anyways? Feels like I've really forsaken that so much of my life, the importance of just learning from God. Well, to be honest with you, the more that I pray for some of my shortcomings, like, things that are real, that we can be dismissive about, like my lack of patience, or maybe stinginess. And this one's been hurting a lot lately, but just to be honest, just sometimes the fact that I just don't love people well. When I have been praying about those things and inviting God to speak to me, it hasn't always been pleasant. It hasn't. Because what I find is like, all right, I'm praying about it like in the morning. Later in the afternoon, I do something that reminds me that I'm not making progress and that it's still there and it's just as bad as it was yesterday. At the same time, in the middle of all of this, I feel like what God is doing is He is giving me a new frame to think about those things. It's not like when I all of a sudden don't love somebody well in a certain moment that I'm backtracking or I'm backsliding. It's something that was just there already. It was always there. It was like, it didn't just appear, it was there. And God is actually in that moment when I can see it with my eyes, because I can see it with my eyes, and He is teaching me. God is present in that moment. He's showing me something. And friends, if He is teaching us something, as hard as that teaching might be, He is loving us. I had the chance to sit down with Bill Farron. You heard from him a couple weeks ago. He shared a little bit about CCA Helps and the wonderful ministry that is. So we got to update each other a little bit on some of the work that's happened there. And I just want to double down. I just love that ministry so much, because as a small church, we cannot do everything. There are organizations that do things so much better. But we can partner with those organizations, and we can sometimes offer something unique, like a cherry on top of an organization. And we're doing that through Joyce Hawkinson's counseling ministry, and certainly through Bill's ministry of just providing some financial counseling to clients that come through Share. That's really unique, and what's beautiful about it, it's not just helping people in hard spaces, it's counseling them so that they can get out of those hard spaces. And just a few weeks ago, he met with somebody from that attends another church, and we were offering some financial assistance, and Bill shared that you could see the surprise, because they're like, wait, another church would help somebody at another church? Like that's a thing? And it's like, absolutely. Bill said, if I were to tell the church, they would applaud, and that's the kind of church we were striving to be. And yes, it's so awesome. It's so great to not just be cutting a check, but to be the hands and feet of Jesus in these spaces. But the truth is, not everybody who comes for financial counseling is ready to see the truth. You can lay out the numbers, and they'll look at it and they'll say, oh yeah, the debt's bad. The credit card bill is way too high. They'll look at it in a way, but there's something that persists where they're not ready for the change, so they can't look at it as it actually is. So no change happens, because really they're not seeing it. But some people do. Some people make the cuts that they need to make. Some people make the decisions that they need to make, take the steps, get different jobs that can meet their family's needs, work harder, save, do all of those things that are in line with wisdom. Some people take that step. And I think there's a really powerful lesson in all that for us that relates to our subject. If we don't see the sin, its breadth, its nature, and its power, if we don't really see it for what it is, which is why this sermon has been so heavy, we focus so much on it. We don't face it honestly, then we will not be able to move forward. It has to start there. God helps us walk faithfully by helping us walk truthfully, most of us, well, we don't like sitting in the dark. And I want to do something different to kind of wrap this sermon, pull it all together. I'm going to have our lights team just go ahead and turn those lights down. It's not perfectly dark in here, but you can get the image a little bit. Most of us don't like sitting in the dark. When we're in this space, we want the light to come back on. There's almost instinctively, there's a part of us that is waiting for the light. We're not really sitting in the dark, reflecting, taking it in, looking, well, at least thinking about what it means. We're just waiting for the fix to come, for somebody to switch the light back on. But if we do that too quickly, if we rush to the light too quickly, then we might misunderstand what the light really means. Thankfully, this isn't the end of the story in Genesis. The very next verse, verse 8 of chapter 6, starts with something really important. But Noah was a faithful, righteous man. And after the flood, there's promise. The way that the author of Genesis talks about Noah, he kind of frames him as a new Adam. Everything is going to start fresh with Noah. The land appears. Noah steps on dry land again. He plants a garden just like Adam did. And then just like Adam, he takes from that garden in a way that he wasn't supposed to. And one of his sons does something shameful and exposes Noah's shame, and it begins again. So there's this moment where we have the but Noah moment, right? It's like, we have the fix. Genesis is coming along, and then there's light, a new Adam, a new world, a fresh start, and then it's gone. Wasn't it? And then comes a man named Abraham, a man who left his country because he trusted God. He trusted God that much, he left his home for a place he had never seen. And then as Abraham's story comes along, we think, this is good. God is going to multiply God is going to bring about nations through him. And God will bless all the nations through him. This is the restoration. This is the plan. This is going back to the beginning. It's all going to be good. And then Abraham lies, and he doesn't trust God, and he's afraid. Friends, it keeps happening like that throughout the whole book. Finally, we get to Joseph, who's in the line of Abraham. Joseph looks a lot like Jesus. He was betrayed by his brothers, and he doesn't show the same failure that so many of the other fathers and patriarchs did in the book of Genesis. At the same time, even as Genesis ends, the world is still broken. The world is not right. Friends, let's just sit here in the darkness for just a moment. Let's not let our eyes go to the dark or the light. Let's let it weigh on what it means. Let's reflect on its weight and its damage and the consequences. Because when we understand it, when we can at least get a little bit of comprehension about it, what we find in the middle of it is a God who is teaching us, a God who is with us, a God who is exposing us to it, exposing ourselves and the darkness in us to ourselves, not to discourage us, but to give us hope, to create space once again in our lives for joy and for light. A light that can come back into your family. You can raise the lights again. A light that can come back into your home when somebody finally tells the truth. I was harsh, I was hiding. A light that can break into your marriage when we stop pretending that silence equals peace. A light that can break into a child's heart when we say, I shouldn't have spoken the way that I did. A light that can break into a friendship when somebody admits, I was jealous, and because of that, I was cold. A light that can break into the church when we stop wearing masks while refusing to live without hope. That's what we can be. That's what we can be. Not because we're pretending that the darkness isn't there, but because we have seen the darkness and we've stopped pretending it's not there. That will allow us to bring light into those spaces. And as God meets us there in the truth, in the exposure, where the masks come off, we will find that there is mercy in the mirror. So when God shows you what is bent, do not surrender from it. Do not run. Don't hide. Receive it as his love. Take the next faithful step and walk with him. Let's pray.